Just off the Adriatic coast of Italy, there's an archipelago of nondescript mudflats. After the fall of the Roman Empire, they became a safe haven for families fleeing from barbarian invaders. I've always been intrigued by how this waterlogged refugee camp on the periphery of the Italian mainland came to be at the very heart of Renaissance civilization. Thanks to its unusual geography, its trading contacts with a multitude of different peoples, and its unique republican constitution, Venice came to represent a tremendously powerful ideal of political and artistic liberty. Venetian art reflected the character of a maritime city that was also a melting pot of cultures. This art didn't just change the course of the Renaissance, it shaped forever our Western notion of what painting can be. Venice metamorphosed into something more than a place. It became a state of mind. Trade was the lifeblood of Venice. At the start of their history, Venetians ferried salt and fish up the rivers of northern Italy to sell in exchange for the grain that they couldn't grow. During the Renaissance, as cities grew in size across Europe, Venetians became suppliers of luxury goods from the Orient, silks, and spices like saffron, pepper, and cumin. Artists benefited from the trade in rare pigments, while scholarship flourished in a vibrant city where printing was a major industry. Foreign merchants flocked to Venice's teeming wharves, importing new styles and new ideas into this most heterodox of cities. By the 15th century, Venice had developed an unparalleled network of long-distance trade routes to the ports of northern Europe, to Alexandria, and to Constantinople. No other Italian Renaissance city had stronger links with the East. The connection with Byzantium is powerfully felt at Santa Maria dell'Assunta, Venice's first cathedral. The rich decorative traditions of Byzantine art shaped its interior, dominated by the radiant 12th century figure of the Virgin Mary. Towering over the interior like a lighthouse set in a sea of gold, she's a beacon of hope for a people whose destiny was to live in permanent exile. The influence of the Byzantine mosaic tradition was to persist into the Renaissance, long after political ties with the East had been severed. Venetian painters would treat their canvases as surfaces to be animated by the sparkle of light. While Renaissance Venice would always be shaped by the world beyond, we shouldn't sentimentalize its openness to other cultures. In the 16th century, the Venetians invented the ghetto. This hidden-away part of Venice, formerly the metalworkers' district, became home to the city's Jews, who were allowed to set up loan banks and to trade. But this was Venetian self-interest, rather than enlightened racial tolerance. Jews played a vital part in the creation and circulation of the city's wealth, but they were also victims of Christian prejudice and forced to live in a kind of quarantine. Surrounded on all four sides by canals, the ghetto was an island where they were locked up at nightfall. A contemporary sculpture commemorates Venetian Jews deported to the death camps in 1943, but they're almost entirely absent from Venetian Renaissance art. They remained its concealed other, only given a voice by Shakespeare in The Merchant of Venice. If you prick us, do we not bleed, says Shylock. If you poison us, do we not die? Other foreigners, as long as they were Christians, were more fully integrated into the city's social and political life. They were actively encouraged to set up religious institutions called scuole, which became an important source of patronage to the city's artists. The Scuola of St. George was founded by immigrant Slavs from Dalmatia in Eastern Europe. They gathered here to pray, administer charity, and learn to become good Venetians. The Scuola commissioned the artist Vittore Carpaccio to paint scenes from the life of Saint Jerome, one of their patron saints. Saint Jerome is shown with the lion he tamed, scattering his terrified fellow monks. In his deathbed scene, he's a gaunt figure expiring under a harsh desert sun. Finally, we see him, or rather we don't, as he appears to St. Augustine as a miraculous ray of light. Augustine, suddenly enlightened, has been updated and imagined as a Venetian Renaissance scholar. The dog is transfixed by the vision of Jerome, just like his master. But Carpaccio only shows us a room suffused with sunshine, a symbol of all that we cannot see, but have to take on faith. By contrast with the contemplative life, Carpaccio painted the very active life of St. George in an exotic foreign land. The saint skewers a plump dragon who still hasn't finished eating all his victims, including a damsel quite beyond distress. George the soldier was an appropriate patron saint for the Dalmatians, who'd themselves fought valiantly in defense of Venetian interests against the increasingly powerful Turks, who were beginning to prey on Venetian territory and on Venetian minds. A dream of converting the heathen may have infused Carpaccio's depiction of St. George baptizing Muslims. If only the Turks would convert to Christianity too, then peace might be maintained. It was said at the time that the Venetians applied the same skill that they showed in the rowing of a gondola to the ruling of men. While every other Italian city-state was divided by faction and bloody infighting, Venice's stability was a source of wonder. The Venetian Republic, unlike the Florentine, resisted autocratic rule throughout the Renaissance and beyond. Venetians believed they owed their liberty to a constitution which had inherited the political wisdom of the classical world, combining monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. The whole was maintained in an elaborate balance, reflected in Gentile Bellini's depiction of the people of the city gathered to witness a religious procession. Shows of public solidarity such as this played a vital part in Venetian civic life. Whether parading or watching, each individual was seen symbolically to be incorporated within the body politic. Even the Venetian head of state, the Doge, is only one more figure in this endless procession. Bellini's created a social panorama where no one seems more important than anyone else, and where everyone has been included. At the start of the 16th century, Gentile's brother, Giovanni Bellini, painted a portrait of Doge Leonardo Loredan. Loredan is poker-faced, impassive. The man has become his office. It's a sensationally unsensational picture, a brilliantly dull celebration of the Venetian cult of impersonality. Elected from a strictly limited group of noble families who maintained the city's constitution, the Doge was in essence a figurehead, his real power carefully circumscribed. Of course, every Doge has his day, but only when he was dead was it permissible for his power and magnificence to be celebrated with a flourish, when it was too late for it to go to his head. Flanked by a pair of slightly effete boys, we see Doge Mocenigo striking a posthumous pose on top of his coffin. Beneath him are tokens of his military successes. The sculptor, Pietro Lombardo, has portrayed him as a Christian warrior in the service of the state. It's a fine balancing act, which others were to misjudge. In the square outside the church, there's a towering example of how not to have yourself glorified in Venice. The memorial to Bartolomeo Colleoni, a mercenary who'd fought on behalf of the city, was designed by the Florentine sculptor Verrocchio towards the end of the 15th century. The sculpture was a great achievement, both of art and of engineering, but the Venetians never really took to it. It was the image of the all-conquering hero, the proud, powerful individual set on high, which they'd always distrusted. To them, the statue of Bartolomeo Colleone embodied an alien and dangerous ideal. Modern Venetians continue their city's long and proud tradition of paying it absolutely no notice at all. The Venetians weren't against display, but there were some situations in which it was more acceptable than others. The best opportunity for a family to show off their success was their palace, built not just to their own glory, but to that of Venice. Each is part of that greater whole, a variegated tessera in the shining mosaic of the city. The impression is enhanced because they're all of a piece, built to the same fundamental design, whatever their decoration. There's no attempt to hide work and business. Nothing could be more functional than the waterfront entrance for loading and unloading, elegantly and simply integrated into the life of the merchant's house. Upstairs, the family's status is reflected on all sides. This is where they would have displayed their pictures. But it's a work of art in itself, a space that plays with those dramatic contrasts of light and dark that are so much a part of Venetian life. The graceful arched window is an elegant frame for the world outside, the thinnest of membranes between the private and public life of the Venetian citizen. On the balcony, it's as if you're in your own box, with all the theatre of Venice spread out before you. Public regattas today are a reminder that the skillful handling of boats has always been the essence of existence here. To protect its trade routes, the city had established itself as a great naval power. Without naval power, Venice was nothing. After the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453, Venice's maritime supremacy was threatened. As one of its ways of bolstering morale, a new architecture emerged. The Republic began to picture itself as a second Rome. The embodiment of this was a gateway for the arsenal, the dockyard where a new galley was built every 100 days. It's highly symbolic that it should have been here that classical architecture was first revived in Venice. Modelled on Roman triumphal arches, it proclaimed the city's might, but with a typically Venetian theatrical flourish. Its fundamental message is blunt. The great winged lion, symbol of St. Mark, the city's patron saint, is borne aloft on classical columns. From these relatively modest beginnings, a whole world of classical architectural forms emerged, transforming the public face of the city. Jacopo Sansovino's great library turned the extension of St. Mark's Square into a Venetian version of the Roman Forum. But at the same time, Venice was a city where they always took the radical idea of a classical rebirth, embodied in the very word Renaissance, with a pinch of salt. In Venice, they certainly believed they had much to learn from antiquity, but they never accepted the idea that the achievements of the more recent past, whether Byzantine or Gothic, must therefore be rejected. Anything a Venetian loved, he kept about him always. taking ideas from all sorts of places, east and west, and from many different periods of history, had always been the Venetian way. A people who had begun with nothing had to make their city up as they went along, stealing bits and pieces from wherever they could to fashion their civic identity. Even its famous lion is less Venetian than it seems. Appropriated from the Middle East, only the wings were made here. To turn him into St. Mark's lion, they were welded on in the 13th century. The epitome of Venice's collage-like nature is the Doge's Palace. It isn't a fortress, but an open structure, lace-like in its delicacy. This is a subtle boast. The Republic is so secure that it doesn't need thick walls and battlements. The building is a compendium of Arab and Islamic motifs, picked up by Venetians on their travels. There are classical elements too, but the building as a whole is a lasting reminder of all that the Renaissance mind had acquired from North Africa and the East. Not just decorative styles, but a mass of ideas, mathematical, astronomical, and philosophical. Ruskin saw the palace as the truest emblem of civilization in all its complexity. He described it as the central building of the world, and I don't think the Venetians would have argued with him. When two great fires destroyed a large part of the palace in the 1570s, Palladio, the city's chief architect, offered to give it a complete Renaissance facelift. It's as if Palladio wanted to sweep the Gothic and Byzantine elements of the city into the sea. His radicalism was implicit even in his Latin name, Palladio, which he'd adopted in preference to the Venetian name he was born with, della Gondola. But in the end, his offer to rebuild the Doge's Palace in the classical style was rejected. Venice defended its plurality. Venetians benefited not just from their maritime links with the East, but from the land routes that connected them to northern Europe. Artists like Dürer came to Venice to see the latest developments in painting. But equally, Venice had acquired a taste for the Gothic style of the north. Inside San Zaccaria, there's a shining example of the Venetians' special affection for the style. Commissioned from a group of Venetian artists in the 1440s by the nuns of the church, daughters of wealthy merchants, it testifies to their taste for beaten gold and expensive pigments. In the vault above are figures painted at much the same time by the Florentine Andrea Castagna, another startling contrast in this city of juxtapositions, showing the advent of a more realistic style pioneered in Tuscany. But the sheer prominence given to this golden multi-panelled altarpiece affirmed Venetian loyalty to a style that had by now fallen out of fashion in other parts of Italy. In the crypt below, its otherworldly splendour has only been enhanced by the incursions of flood water, making it a quintessentially Venetian achievement, a vision of heaven raised above muddy water. Venetian art, like so much else in Venice, was based on a distinctive sense of tradition and continuity. The contrast with a city such as Florence could hardly be stronger. In Florence, the artist might admire the past, but his task was essentially to surpass it, to kill the father. But in Venice, the artist always tried to learn from the father and to build on his achievements. Venetian art developed through innovations and ideas passed down from father to son, literally so in the case of the drawings made by Jacopo Bellini, which he bequeathed to his sons Gentile and Giovanni. These vivid works are the building blocks of the Venetian painting tradition. Jacopo isn't very well known, but he was a pioneer. Everywhere we look in his sketchbooks, it's as if we see, laid out before us, the future of Venetian art itself. Giovanni Bellini must have referred to his father's drawings when he created this radiant altarpiece of the baptism of Christ for the church of San Corona in Vicenza at the beginning of the 16th century. In adapting his father's ideas, he also transformed them. The three persons of the Trinity are united in a single line which bisects the picture, drawing the eye down naturally from the face of God the Father, through the dove of the Holy Spirit, through the drops of water which have been painted with such delicacy, and onto the head of Christ. The blue distances recall the effects of atmosphere observed by Leonardo da Vinci, who visited Venice at around the time this picture was painted. But Bellini was less of a scientist than Leonardo. His picture is driven by the force of religious conviction. The eye is drawn back through space into a landscape which itself seems blessed, as if the whole visible world has been baptized with a message of hope. Landscape haunted the Venetians' imagination. It was the Garden of Eden from which they'd been expelled when they were forced to escape to the sea at the start of their history. During the early 15th century, the countryside to the north of Venice had been annexed by the Republic to protect its back and to guarantee a food supply. This mainland territory has come to be known as the Veneto. With the revival of ancient Roman ideals of landscape, it acquired a new poetic meaning. Retreating to nature was linked to the classical dream of recovering a lost, golden world of simplicity, a pastoral paradise they called Arcadia, where city folk could come to retune the strings of their weary souls. If Arcadia could be said to have a capital, it would be the hill town of Asolo. The scholar-poet Pietro Bembo coined the word asolare to describe the pastoral dolce vita led here. It was here at the Barco della Regina that poets, philosophers and painters gathered to enjoy that sophisticated version of the simple life that the pastoral celebrated. Not much remains today of the house, which was built by the exiled Queen of Cyprus to console herself during her widowhood. Yet the melancholy that haunts these few remaining fragments was itself a part of pastoral's potent appeal. Rustic retreat was a way of turning sorrow and disillusionment with city life into a form of bittersweet poetry. To the Romans, pastoral was on a relatively low rung of the literary and artistic ladder. Writing pastoral was how a great Roman poet like Virgil served his apprenticeship, before going on to write his epic masterpiece, the Aeneid. But during the Renaissance, the Venetians reversed this classical hierarchy. They shunned the epic and elevated the pastoral and other contemplative or pleasure-seeking types of art to the highest pinnacle. Out of the fanciful world of Arcadia came one of the most fascinating paintings in the history of art. Giorgioni's Tempest was a new kind of picture, a painted poem. It's in the tradition of Bellini's religious landscapes, but God has been left out. Its haunting subject appealed to the sophisticated, pleasure-seeking merchant nobility, and it's saturated in the mood of Venetian pastoral. But the subject remains one of the great unsolved riddles. Who is the half-naked woman breastfeeding her child? And who is the wistful young man looking across at her? What does the storm with its flash signify? Sudden revelation? Or a moment that's gone forever? Giorgioni's great innovation was to paint directly onto the canvas without preparatory sketches, which gave his work an unparalleled immediacy. There are clues to the mystery of the Tempest in a contemporary book by Francesco Colonna called the Hypnerotomachia Polyphili, the first stream of consciousness novel. It's the story of a hero's dream quest for a beautiful woman who embodies all the virtues of the classical past. Eventually he finds her, but on waking, realizes that he has lost her once more. The Tempest shares the eroticism and the nostalgia of Colonna's story. Giorgioni's scene itself closely corresponds to one of the hero's visions, of Venus breastfeeding Cupid. The prominent broken column, colonna in Italian, could well be a visual pun on the author's name. Giorgioni's picture hints at loss and separation. It's unlikely we'll ever decipher it completely, but its enigma is part of the poetry. Giorgioni died young, but he'd helped sow the seeds for a transformation of painting. Immediately in his wake came a man who was to make Venetian art famous throughout the world. His name was Titian. Titian's gift was for drama and life. In Bacchus and Ariadne, he orchestrates an unforgettable erotic encounter. The heroine waves towards the sea after Theseus, who's abandoned her. But even as one lover departs, another materializes in the shape of the smitten god of wine. Both are stunned by the sudden emotion of love at first sight. Bacchus's clamorous retinue of nymphs and satyrs have been left behind, a noisy irrelevance. Even the necessary frozenness of painting has been made to express that moment when everything comes to a stop for people as they fall for one another. In the hands of Titian, Venetian secular painting offered itself up to be contemplated and enjoyed. Its appeal was to the mind, but also to the senses. In Venice, Renaissance art became more covetable and collectible than ever before. Just as he'd animated classical mythology, so Titian also brought the stories of saints and martyrs to life. In his full maturity, he had the brilliant idea of setting the martyrdom of St. Lawrence at night. Making darkness visible, he created a drama of light and fire. The brazier on which the saint's body writhes glows with an evil intensity, directing the mind's eye to the fires of hell itself. Paint has been treated with a compelling freedom. The flickering torches seem to hint at the upward motion of the saint's soul. In the dark sky, a supernatural light opens up the heavens to receive Lawrence's spirit at the moment of his death. Titian had a masterful sense of the decisive moment, the split second into which all the poignancy and drama of a story has been compressed. Francesco Priscianesi, a Florentine visitor to Venice in the 1540s, left a wonderfully vivid glimpse of Titian's personal world. In a letter, he described a party at the painter's house. After looking at many beautiful pictures on its walls, the guests went into the garden to admire the view across the lagoon. As the sun went down, the sea filled with gondolas adorned with beautiful women, and music floated across the air. There's something extraordinarily modern-sounding about Priscianesi's description. He could almost be talking about a party at Venice's contemporary art festival, the Biennale, where dealers still ply potential customers with food and wine and take advantage of the romantic setting to try to make the art they want to sell seem all the more intoxicating. Titian was one of the first Renaissance artists to realize that business could be profitably mixed with pleasure in this way. He wasn't just a great painter, he was a brilliant entrepreneur. You get an impression of the collectors to whom Titian's work appealed from Lorenzo Lotto's brilliantly penetrating portrait of Andrea Adoni. Adoni was a wine merchant who owned Titian nudes as well as antique sculptures. His uncomfortable expression hints at the danger to his immortal soul of such pagan diversions. In one hand, he holds a figure from his collection, but in the other, he holds a cross, as if to admit his unease. From Venice outwards to as far afield as Spain, Titian played the market brilliantly. His painting came to have tremendous prestige among the power brokers of the age, men like the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. Titian, seen here in a late self-portrait, understood the golden rule of success: make the patron look good. Creating not just a likeness, he turned his sitters into heroes by catching them at some dramatic moment in their lives. Charles V, one of the ugliest men in the world, with his jutting Habsburg jaw, was made to seem the very embodiment of imperial might, advancing with implacable intent towards the unseen Protestant foe. No wonder the emperor loved this picture. Titian's work appealed to more than one generation of Spanish rulers. Philip II's monastery palace, the Escorial, was an outward expression of religious asceticism, but on the inside, its solemnity was enlivened by a virtual harem of nudes. Titian understood his patron's priorities, pointing out on delivery that he'd been careful to show the naked female form both from the rear, in Venus and Adonis, and from the front. In Danae with her nursemaid, he's included the figure of a wrinkled old crone to make Danae's smooth white body all the more alluring. The god Jupiter is making love to her in the form of coins falling into her lap, a golden shower, which explains the expression of orgasmic rapture on her face. Because the rulers of Europe gave his art such prominence in their collections, Titian's work entered the bloodstream of Western civilization. More than any other Renaissance artist, including Michelangelo, he influenced the future of painting. Velázquez, Rembrandt, Rubens, Delacroix, Constable, generation after generation of the great artists learned to see and to paint by studying Titian's work. His painting became the raw material of painting itself. While Spanish power played its part in spreading the word about Venetian genius, it was simultaneously threatening the Venetian spice trade. The second half of the 16th century was a troubled time for the Republic, when general depression was lifted by the occasional false hope. In 1571, a naval victory against the Turks at Lepanto had been seen as a turning of the political tide. On the ceiling of the Grand Council Hall in the Doge's palace, the city's newfound optimism was expressed in Paolo Veronese's great canvas, The Triumph of Venice. The figure of Venetia personifies the city. Framed by the towers of the arsenal, she embodies the resurgence of Venetian naval power. Veronese's contract laid down that he also depict populi festeggianti, applauding multitudes. The onlookers crowding the balcony represent a cross-section of Venetian society, young and old, male and female, rich and poor. Yet, ultimately, this was an empty piece of theatre. The Battle of Lepanto turned out to be a hollow victory. The Turks continued to roll back the Venetian maritime empire. The mainland was now seen increasingly not only as a place of pleasurable retreat, but as an alternative to the risks of foreign trade. Venetians reclaimed the marshy land of the Veneto and invested in farms. In making their move from trade to agriculture, the Venetians awoke from pastoral reverie and unearthed another, more practical aspect of the classical past. Ancient Roman authors such as Cato and Varro had praised agriculture as a fitting occupation for gentlemen. The Venetian aristocrat on his estate in the Veneto came to think of himself as the modern equivalent of a Roman nobleman in his country villa. A new form of building, both practical and idealised, a cross between farmhouse and Roman temple, came into being. It was developed most extensively by the architect Palladio in the many villas which he designed for Venetian landowners. Palladio played themes and variations on this building type, recording them for posterity in his 4 books of architecture, which was to become the pattern book of the 18th century British country house. The Villa Barbaro at Mazara was designed by Palladio in the 1550s. The temple-like central block is flanked by arcades for the storage of grain, beauty and usefulness, cheek by jowl. The Nymphaeum, with its gods of Mount Olympus, is pure antiquarian romance. But the water that collects here also provided irrigation for the villa's gardens and the estate beyond. Palladio's patron, Daniele Barbaro, had been ambassador to England, and he wrote a treatise on the English political system for the ever-inquisitive Venetian state. He was also interested in reviving lost classical arts of decoration. Drawing on descriptions by writers like Pliny the Elder, he invited Veronese to reimagine the landscape scenes which would once have decorated Roman villas, as well as introducing members of the Barbaro family into his painted world. Practicality and art are thoroughly intertwined, but in the end, fantasy wins out over reality. The ultimate effect is of a wonderfully delicate bubble of illusions. The villa is a time machine, a place where a Venetian senator could almost believe that he'd become one of the ancient Romans he loved to read about. The Venetian love affair with classical antiquity reached a climax during the second half of the 16th century, when an extraordinary scheme was hatched to dismantle an entire Roman amphitheatre in the city of Pula in former Yugoslavia, and to rebuild it stone by stone in the centre of Venice. In the end, that proved beyond even Venetian ingenuity, but I think it's a very revealing story. As the Venetians' empire began to decline, their taste for spectacle on an imperial Roman scale grew ever greater. The Venetians had always had a way of shining in adversity. The bubonic plague, which regularly ravaged a city that was home to ships and rats, also inspired one of the most stunning pictorial ensembles ever created. The Scuola Grande di San Rocco was founded to house the relics of Saint Roch, patron saint of plague victims. The man commissioned to decorate it was Jacopo Tintoretto, who worked for 23 years to create its 60 monumental canvases, all reflecting the mission of the Scuola to comfort the sick and the dying. The result is a self-contained world of art, often twilit or nocturnal, which crackles with spiritual electricity. Tintoretto painted with a freedom that's almost hallucinatory. This heterodox style, combining East and West, stylization and naturalism, offers a radiant affirmation of the Venetian view of civilization, something made richer, not poorer, by the marriage of cultural opposites. The visible brushstroke, suppressed in the art of Florence and Rome for the sake of a seamless illusion, was given a special eloquence in Venetian painting. This isn't pictorial experiment for its own sake. It's as if Tintoretto set out to paint the soul rather than the body. His work comes to a climax in a vast, brooding crucifixion. With a cast of what seems like thousands, it's more than 40 feet wide. Yet it has a tremendous, compressed energy. All the lines of perspective, all the gestures of the spectators converge to a single point: the suffering, dying Christ. His shadowed head emits beams of light, a halo that makes of him a second son, as well as the Son of God, the centre of all this busy tumult. In Tintoretto's painting, so much that is distinctively Venetian comes together. Touch, colour, light, feeling, drama, and running through it all, a compelling, unorthodox originality. By the time Tintoretto had completed his masterpiece, Venetian painting had come to embody a philosophy of art freer and less doctrinaire than those of the other great Renaissance cities. Ever since, it's drawn generation upon generation of painters into its orbit. El Greco, Turner, Monet, all took something from the Venetian tradition. But although Venice came to stand for light and for liberty, there was always a suspicion that the city and its art were lacking in seriousness. The artists of Florence started it by complaining that the Venetians, for all their mastery of colour, lacked skill in draftsmanship, supposedly the more intellectual branch of art. The Venetians, it was said, failed to elevate painting out of the material world and make it the expression of an idea. To my mind, one painting demolishes that argument forever. At the end of his life, Titian painted an altarpiece which he intended should hang above his tomb. He died in 1576 of the plague before he could finish it. Titian has wrought a kind of violence on his own technique. Flesh that was once almost palpitatingly alive has died. The mosaic in the apse still gleams, but the golden light of Byzantium has almost gone out. The artist included himself in this mystery, in the figure of Saint Jerome, his last self-portrait. Paint itself, the substance which Titian had made so much his own, seems on the point of dissolution. Christ's dead body is a blur, almost a failed representation, which is perhaps the profoundest touch of all. It's as if what Titian has painted is not a body, but the process of death itself. As we look, we see something that we know we will never truly be able to fix our eyes upon. Death is another country. Titian's work is a reproof to all those who have seen in Venetian art mere seduction and enchantment, while other Renaissance painters had sought to raise their status by arguing that art is a primarily intellectual activity. Titian dignified the manual work of painting itself. He showed that the act of making a mark can be an expression of the highest order of humanity and intelligence. And he proved that the depth and the power of painting derived from the fact that it is, indeed, made by men using their hands. In Titian's art, as in Renaissance Venice, the material and the spiritual were completely intertwined.